Chris O'Connor here. Join our fabulous curmudgeonly community on Facebook at facebook.com/group/curmudgeonrock. Also look out for a Spotify playlist dedicated to this episode. Now, let's get started.
This is the Curmudgeon Rock Report, and this is your podcast made by rock geek iconoclastic outsiders for rock geek iconoclastic outsiders. For those of you who lament that rock music has gone the way of jazz and slipped into niche genre status, we are here to keep that flame alive by providing insight, analysis, recommendations, and honest takes, not hot takes. And hey, there's a good chance you'll learn some rock history you never knew before. As longtime listeners of our podcast know, one of our insistent curmudgeonly theories is that there have been 4 golden ages of rock. A couple of years ago, we started with the 4th and last one, the period covering 1991 through 97, and devoted 9 episodes to it. We then went backward and covered the first golden age, that initial burst of rock and roll spanning 1954 through 59, and made a 2-parter out of it. Then we went back to epic length and did a 9-part series on the second golden age, where and when rock came of age, with each part covering each year between 1964 and 72. Well, it only makes sense that we complete the circle and fill in that massive gap with that third golden age, and here it is. The first episode of 5 episodes reviewing the third golden age of rock, 1976 to 1980. During this era, rock music went through a radical transformation thanks to the earth-shaking punk movement. And in due time, we had post-punk, new wave, synth-pop, and the beginnings of indie rock. Disparate styles such as funk and disco were also brought into the mix to produce some of the greatest and frankly sexiest rock music ever made that still resonates today. For the purpose of this first episode in the series, the one focusing on 1976, this year is generally viewed as ground zero for this tectonic shift, with the Ramones and the Sex Pistols busting out and breaking the mold for everyone from opposite ends of the Atlantic. Conventional or traditional rock that got on FM radio was still going strong though, with a revamped Fleetwood Mac, the Eagles, Bob Seger, Boston, Aerosmith, and the Rolling Stones all releasing seminal and mostly all-time great albums. Some of the solo auteurs of the era also put out innovative, career-defining works in the form of Stevie Wonder, David Bowie, and Frank Zappa. And some legends released some of their most underratedly brilliant albums in the form of Bob Dylan, Lou Reed, Funkadelic, and Patti Smith. So sit back and brace yourself for the year zero of punk rock that shook the genre of rock music to its foundations, influenced everything in its wake, whether those influences wanted to be influenced or not, spawned multiple offshoots and subgenres also in its wake, and created cultural reverberations that we still feel today in contemporary music. So, welcome to the third golden age of rock, kicking off in 1976, and welcome to the Curmudgeon Rock Report.
Cool. We get to travel back to 1976 on this episode. But first, we get to travel to a place where it's always 1976, man. You know where that is, right, Arturo?
Why, where is that place, Chris?
That would be what we know as the parallel universe. Yes, we are ripping the space-time continuum and stepping over into the other realm where rock and roll is still the big shit. It's, people are still putting their lighters above their heads. They're still wearing the jean jacket with Megadeth patches on them. Everything rock and roll is still cool and is still predominant in the culture. It's not just all. It's not monomania with Taylor Swift and Beyonce. There's actually room for real rock and roll bands and real rock and roll and other diverse forms of music that we think that you ought to rock out to and ought to fill those stadiums. And so that's just a long way of saying this is how we the segment of the show where we cover new and newish artists that we think that you should dig and are at least doing interesting stuff. That's the thing. There's a journalistic component to this too. We're telling you, folks who are out there at least trying to do good stuff.
Yeah.
And so
Yes.
with that said, Arturo, who are you covering on this episode's version of the Parallel Universe?
The latest album by El Khat, and the album is called Mute. Now, since 2019 and hailing from Yemen, the collective known as El Khat have been bewitching music fans who have been open-minded enough to listen with some of the most thrillingly original music to come out of any country. For those of you who are geographically challenged, Yemen is at the very southern end of the Arabian Peninsula, meaning it's south of Saudi Arabia. As for the group's name, El is the article that in Arabic means the, same as in Spanish. Just tells you that a lot of what we know now as the Spanish language actually is derived from Arabic, believe it or not. And the word khat, Khat, refers to the addictive leaf that has been chewed by Yemeni people for over 600 years. The members themselves aren't all Yemeni, though. Members hail from Iraq, Morocco, and even Poland. They currently reside in Berlin, and Mute, their third album, is a fine-tuning of their enchanting sound. Now, what is that sound? They basically take the indigenous folk music of Yemen and give it a full band ensemble sound with mostly homemade instruments. The keyboard/organ and trumpets actually, are the only conventional instruments played. What sounds like guitars, violins, and drums are actually recycled plastic, metal, and wood, shaped and adapted into brand new original instrumentation. The closest thing Western ears can make out of this music is Middle Eastern sounding jazz, but with a bombastic, raucous intensity and a heavier emphasis on percussion than on previous Khat albums. To quote a review from the Financial Times, quote, El Khat make joyful clatter. Everything is recycled metal, plastic, or wood, all coming together in a funeral march that sounds like a huge disgruntled anima shaking itself into life. I'll admit this music is not for everyone. Most listeners may not even like it, but I'm always on the lookout for thoroughly original, weird new music. For me, it's a solid 4-star album that is further testament to El Khat being one of the most exciting bands on the planet. Chris?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. This is definitely a good new sound. And I guess if they use homemade instrumentation, you could call this Arabic skiffle.
Arabic
music.
what?
Skiffle.
Skiffle? Okay.
Yeah. Kind of like skiffle music in New Orleans.
Yeah.
So it's
washboard shit.
Yeah, it's the same idea. It's just, you just grab whatever's laying around and turn it into an instrument. It's the same ethic. And they do come up with some cool stuff. My favorite thing in listening to my early listens to this record is a 59-second track near the beginning of the record called Tabel Yamani, which is all percussion, and it's just really, really killer in terms of how it has those funky, exotic Middle Eastern rhythms.
Yeah.
And it has that kind of clang and bang, but done in a rhythmic, kind of cool, arranged way. It's organized chaos, and so I really like that. I also like the song Commodore Lothan, which kind of harkens back a little bit to the stuff that they were doing on the previous album, which you covered a couple years ago on this podcast.
Yes, I did.
And at the time, I mistakenly referred to it as Iraqi King Crimson. And like I said, they're Yemeni, but they have an Iraqi member, and so I took it. I saw them referred to as Iraqi, and so But they were working with some bona fide prog rock at that point, and so they've kind of ratcheted that down on this album, and it's more sort of traditional folky, like Middle Eastern folky kind of stuff. But it's still
this is their folkiest of the 3 albums. The first one had kind of like the first album, which came out before we ever started this podcast, had more kind of a rockish, almost psychedelic feel. The second one is, as you called it, it had more of a prog rock thing. This one's definitely folkier and jazzier too.
Yeah, I don't know if I necessarily call it folkier so much. It's their most indigenous record.
Yeah,
and it's their most parochial.
And it's very percussion heavy. Really
Yeah, very
percussion.
very percussion heavy, and it's very parochial. It's kind of, of the region
Yeah.
more than the other records. And so yeah, no, you're right. And in terms of picking up on a new weird sound that
Yeah.
a lot of people would be like, "What the hell is this shit?"
Yeah.
But that's kind of what we dig, and that's one of the points of the parallel universe is
Right.
experimentation is exciting.
Yeah.
It doesn't always work, but you have to celebrate exciting experimentation. And for the most part, from what I've heard so far, and again, I've only heard the album like twice, and so I need to spend more time with it. But from what
Yeah.
I've heard, it's exciting experimentation that pretty much hits the mark.
Yeah.
Now,
Let's put El Cott on the cover of Rolling Stone.
yeah, absolutely, or at least, yeah, pictures of them chewing on the Cot leaf.
On
At least they'll be getting high.
the
So there you go. So now, speaking of exciting experimentation, that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. Uh, as we said, part of the spirit of the parallel universe is to look at stuff that's interesting and cool and weird. And so, weird is still acceptable in the parallel universe. It's not as A&R, and it's not as sort of TikTok obsessed as
Mm.
sort of the mainstream is these days. But but sometimes the stuff we cover on this segment, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And then you have an album like Geordie Greep's The New Sound, which sometimes really works and sometimes really doesn't work.
Mm.
And I wanted to cover Geordie Greep because he was the lead singer and one of the chief songwriters in this band that I covered a couple years back on this podcast called Black Midi.
You say was or he still is?
As far as I know, they're pretty much broken up. He
Oh,
admitted in an
okay.
interview with NME that they're pretty much on a permanent hiatus. And so
Permanent hiatus.
yeah, and so they're basically broken up. There's a chance they may come back, but they're pretty much done. But the thing with Black Midi is they were I like to refer to them as controlled wackiness. And
Yeah.
I really like Black Midi. They're the best of those modern day, the younger art school bands in Britain. The most prominent of those bands lately is this really awful, shitty band called Black Country New Road, which the young British music press loves, but we both hate.
No one
Uh,
else likes them, actually.
yeah, it was probably the worst album of the 2020s that they came out with in 22. But Black Midi, I thought, was the best of those bands because let's just put it this way: they had a single in 22. I covered their album Hellfire, and the best song from Hellfire was the best song I heard in 2022, and I actually talked about it in our year-end episode that year. Was called "Welcome to Hell," which basically is like a bastard child of The Fall, Primus, and Metallica. It's just really strange, really quirky, really kind of it goes in and out of speed metal and goes in and out of like wacky bass stuff, and it's just blenderized psychedelia sped up and cranked up with like almost like a meth kind of feel to it, and I loved it. And so they were definitely a controlled wackiness. They were the best variety of art school band of the modern day. Now, fast forward a couple years later, as I said, according to interviews that Geordie Greep, who is basically the leader of that band, has given, they're now broken up. And so Greep has come out with his solo debut, which he calls The New Sound. And if Black Midi was controlled wackiness, this album can just be charitably called uncontrolled wackiness. It for 75% of the album, it counts as basically a 3-star record, and it's notable for the hybrid that he's trying to go for. It certainly is a new sound. Thank God it's not going to be the new sound. It's basically what he's doing is he's taking Latin musical forms such as bossa nova and samba, and he's splicing them with very late 70s yacht rock, most especially Gaucho era Steely Dan and Look Sharp era Joe Jackson. And so he's got a lot of that kind of lush sort of arrangements and production, but mixed in with sort of samba and bossa nova and other sort of Latin flavors. And again, it's wacky and it mixes in a little bit of prog rock here, a little bit of metal there, but mostly is splicing those. And he's also a fan of torch song melodies, which is to say he fancies himself as kind of an ironic lounge singer while he's also dealing with all this. And so, yeah, if that doesn't sound appealing, I don't blame you. But there is some great stuff on this record. There's the single "Holy Holy,"
Yeah.
which is probably the most Steely Danish song on the record. But it's him just hamming it up with the
Yeah.
concept and really having fun with it. And he's also at his best when he just kind of when he tamps down the yacht rock and really just sticks to the jazz, as on the title track, "The New Sound," the song "Through a War," and the song "Bongo Season." And then he's got just like really cool little diversion, like the latter half of the song "Motorbike," which is not that great of a song, but it has this outro, which is this psychedelic garage rock ramp up with just kind of this like warbling guitar, which is actually really cool. So it's a nice little earworm stuck in an otherwise not so great song. So this goes on like this for the first 75% of this record. And then you get to the last three songs, "As If Waltz," "The Magician," and "If You Are But a Dream." And it devolves into psychedelic dramaturgy. And, think Tom Waits, but without the sincerity.
Yeah.
And Greep also kind of he kind of plays lounge lizard, but he's also a scatological, dirty lounge lizard. So there's lots of like kind of gross sexual imagery and just gratuitous use of words like "cunt" and things like that. But it really devolves into this just sloppy dramaturgy, kind of overly dramatic torch music at the end,
Right.
and ruins what otherwise was a pretty cool, pretty good attempt at a really clever shtick.
Hmm.
And again, it's got some merits, and I wouldn't discount it. I do think it is worth one listen, fully. And again, it's one of these things in a parallel universe where we're turning you on to folks that are trying new things. And so some of you, who knows, it's one of these polarizing albums. Maybe you'll love it because it's got your kind of wackiness to it, or maybe you'll hate it because you think it's just a big steaming pile of shit. But you'll have an opinion about it one way or another. It's not a middle ground kind of record. Greep definitely is a talent. He's definitely has a lot of bona fides, but he needs editors. He needs people to rein him in. He needs discipline, and he got a little bit of that. Even though Black Midi was a pretty wacky band, he did get some of that from them, and you can tell that they probably reined in some of his weirder impulses because some of the
Yeah.
stuff that shows up on here didn't show up on Black Midi.
Mhm.
So that's what I could say. Overall, it's barely a three-star record. I think it's worth a listen. I like what Greep is going for. Hopefully, he's a young guy and he's got a lot of career ahead of him. Hopefully, he does get some of that discipline, and hopefully, he can up his songwriting a little bit more, and he can like leave the dramaturgy behind. Bertolt Brecht, he ain't. Let's just put it that way. So Arturo, I know you're not as big of a fan of Black Midi as I am, and I'm sure you probably have even a lower opinion of this Greep album than I do.
Yep. Yeah, I only got through the first 4 or 5 songs of this record and I couldn't listen anymore. I think you kind of nailed it. It's like Joe Jackson doing Latin music, but without the hooks and without the soul.
Yeah,
It's
at
this.
least Joe Jackson had plenty of hooks. I mean, I like Joe
Yeah, I
Jackson.
mean, and Joe Jackson was a one-hit wonder. There's a reason why, because he was basically a third-rate Elvis Costello. Let's just face
I
it.
know. Hey, I like the album "Look Sharp." That's a good album.
you know. But as far as this Geordie Greep record goes, like there's certain kind of musician that comes from music school, like this guy does. Okay, where to them music is only good if it's as complex as possible. Music has to have the most complex chord progressions, the trickiest time signatures, and the most changes and movements within a song as possible. And complexity does not equal quality. In fact, it rarely does.
Hey,
You
he's
know,
better than Joe Satriani.
yeah, well, it doesn't say anything. I mean,
Yeah,
with people like this, it's just like they don't listen to music with their heart. They listen to music with their heads a
yeah.
little too much. The balance is off. And that is why they make music that's just needlessly complex, impenetrable, unlistenable, and no one's going to remember it in the future. So it's crap.
Yeah, I mean,
there's a reason why like Oasis has become so popular among like younger generation Gen Z music fans. It's straightforward. It's got melody. You can hum along to it. You can sing along to it.
and
Good God.
and it bashes the fuck out. Yeah.
It rocks and it has melodies and it has hooks and riffs. Good God. What's wrong with that?
Chris here again. Arturo and I have differing feelings about the subscription streaming service Spotify. While he likes to rail against the algorithmic component, I like the ability to find and then manage a personal catalog of music. The program is especially great for assembling playlists. Well, guess what? We've assembled a playlist to accompany this episode. The playlist features a healthy mix of all the music we describe and analyze during the episode. Think of it as a soundtrack to your curmudgeonly life. Find the link in this episode's description. And also become a member of our curmudgeonly community on Facebook if you haven't done so already. Let's now return to our regularly scheduled programming. Here we are, folks, at the beginning of the third golden age of rock, which begins in 1976. Why do we think that this streak from 1976 to 1980 was a golden age for rock? Well, it really starts with the winding down of soft rock and the turning up of what became known as punk rock. And any discussion of the punk rock movement has to start in New York City, has to start with the CBGB scene, and has to start with this little band from Queens known as the Ramones. So Arturo, kick us off in our 1976 memory alley with the Ramones.
There's a lot to cover here. Any discussion about the year zero of punk, that is 1976, has to start with the story of the Ramones. They're that important. And while the year 1976 saw the release of some truly all-time great albums, which we'll also discuss later in this episode, the Eagles, Hotel California, Stevie Wonder's Songs in the Key of Life, Aerosmith's Rocks, David Bowie's Station to Station, et cetera, none were, in the long run, more influential and impactful, both musically and, more importantly, culturally, than the Ramones' self-titled debut. Whereas most of the musicians and artists that made up the way downtown CBGB's club scene in New York City were of the middle class variety, or in American parlance, upper middle class, or the art school variety, the four original members of the Ramones were strictly working class kids. As you can hear in any interview done with them where their New York accents came through. It's a socioeconomic identity that made them stand out from the rest of the music scene that they came from. Take a map of New York City and zero in on the borough of Queens. Take a map of the borough of Queens and zero in on the neighborhood of Forest Hills. Take a map of Forest Hills and zero in on Forest Hills High School, where all four members of the Ramones went to school and met. John Cummings, a military school dropout and son of a waitress mother and construction working father, as working class as it gets, befriended Thomas Erdelyi, a Hungarian immigrant kid whose Jewish parents survived the Holocaust. Their love of 1950s rock and roll and the early Beatles inspired them to form their own garage rock band called the Tangerine Puppets, who lasted from about 1965 to 67. The Forest Hills social scene must have been pretty small because even after finishing high school, Cummings and Erdelyi befriended then high school student Douglas Colvin. Colvin was your classic military brat. His father was an American soldier. His mother was German. He was born in a military base in Fort Lee, Virginia. The family relocated from one town in Germany to another until his parents separated and he, his mother, and his sister moved for good to Forest Hills, Queens. A thorough love of music tied these misfits together, and it was through Colvin that a tall, skinny, gawky, shy Jewish kid by the name of Jeffrey Hyman came into the fold and became part of their greater social orbit. For the next several years, nothing much else happened except for Hyman joining a glam rock band called Sniper as their lead singer from 1972 through 74. Soon after being fired from that band, Hyman soon found out that John Cummings and Doug Colvin were planning to form a band of their own, and they invited Hyman to join them. Colvin would play guitar and sing. Cummings would also play guitar. A buddy named Richie Stein would play bass, and Hyman would man the drum kit. As for Tommy Erdelyi, who actually had genuine musical experience, he started working as a sound engineer at New York's legendary Record Plant recording studio shortly after finishing high school. In fact, he worked as an assistant engineer on the production of Jimi Hendrix's legendary live album, Band of Gypsies from 1970. Erdelyi signed on to be the young band's manager, overall advisor, and producer when the time came to record. After a few rehearsals, it became clear that Stern, I misspoke by calling him Stein, Stern couldn't play bass and he was let go. Colvin switched from guitar to bass while still singing, and the nascent group was now a trio. Doug Colvin got the idea of calling himself D.D. Ramone from Paul McCartney, who used the pseudonym Paul Ramone when the Beatles were very briefly known as the Silver Beatles back in their very early days. He convinced the others to adopt pseudonyms as well. John Cummings became Johnny Ramone, and Jeff Hyman became Joey Ramone. As a whole, they were now and forever to be the Ramones. During this early stage of the band's lifetime, Tommy Erdelyi's role as manager was clearly a leadership one as well, for it was he who suggested the uniform look of all the band members wearing t-shirts, leather jackets, and ripped blue jeans, making them resemble a gang more so than a band. Unbeknownst to Erdelyi, he would soon have to step in as an actual member. After a few more rehearsals, Dee soon realized that he couldn't play bass and sing effectively at the same time. There was also the fact that Dee was a pretty shitty singer, something akin to a really pissed off Bugs Bunny. Seriously, go look up any songs on YouTube where Dee sings lead. He sounds like an angry Bugs Bunny. Anyway, during a rehearsal, Joey randomly walked up to the mic and started singing. Everyone loved it, and Erdelyi encouraged Joey to be the full-time lead singer. That solved one problem, but opened another familiar problem. Joey could not play drums and sing at the same time. So Joey was then moved to the role of traditional frontman lead singer while they auditioned new potential drummers. None of the people they auditioned proved satisfactory, with Erdelyi often having to instruct the auditioners how to actually play the songs. It became apparent to the other members that it would be better off if their manager/advisor just picked up the sticks and did the drumming himself. He accepted, with Thomas Erdelyi becoming Tommy Ramone, and the core original quartet was complete. The Ramones' first ever public performance was on March 20th, 1974 at the Performance Studios, a fancy name for what was otherwise a public co-opt at a loft apartment for local people who wanted to perform music or show art exhibits for friends and family. If they wanted to get real experience performing for real music crowds, though, they needed to find a real club. During this time, the new music of New York City's burgeoning new music scene was focused on two venues. The first was Max's Kansas City, which had been around since the mid-1960s and was located on Park Avenue South near Gramercy Park. It was a favorite of Andy Warhol and his decadent, stylish, artsy entourage. More importantly, it hosted shows by some of rock's greatest, most cutting-edge artists in their early years, and even further. The Velvet Underground, Lou Reed Solo, Iggy Pop and the Stooges, Alice Cooper, T-Rex, David Bowie, the New York Dolls, Big Star, Aerosmith, Bruce Springsteen, and even Bob Marley. The other venue was a then brand new venue on the Lower East Side of Manhattan known as the Bowery. It was originally an old nondescript dive bar that eventually became a biker bar. A musician and aspiring club owner named Hilly Crystal bought the property and converted it with the hope of it being a venue that would attract musicians to play country, bluegrass, and blues, the genres he loved, hence the club's new name, CBGB's. while young local bands and artists soon started to flock to CBGBs to play there, combining with the growing clientele and audience that would quickly create one of the most important and fertile music scenes the rock era would ever see. The music produced wasn't quite what Crystal had in mind. This was the immediate post-hippie era, and within the underground/counterculture of rock music, there was a growing taste and desire for change in the genre, for new sounds, new styles, a new attitude, and an overall fresh and alternative approach to what mainstream rock radio was offering at the time. There were other cities in the US where similar scenes with similar mentalities were taking shape. But New York, being the cultural capital of the world at the time, it was the new music scene of New York that very quickly caught the music media's eye. In 1974, you had Patti Smith blowing minds away with her genuinely poetic stream of consciousness lyrics, her band's muscular style that combined angry garage rock with the unfolding epic grandeur of Van Morrison, and her inimitable performing style, which evoked the shamanistic intensity of Jim Morrison. You also had Television, a band led by the dueling guitarists Tom Verlaine and Richard Lloyd, whose breathtaking originality defied description at the time. We'll get into them in detail in the 1977 episode of this third Golden Age of Rock series. But what they did was essentially take the improvisational jam band ethos of the Grateful Dead and couch it in weird, angular, spiky, never-before-heard song constructions that both invented new wave pop and predicted post-punk. It was into this brewing maelstrom of creativity and pop cultural change that the Ramones made their CBGB's debut on August 30th, 1974. In quick time, the songs the Ramones wrote, crafted, developed, and honed to military precision were simply revolutionary. Over the next year and a half, the songs the Ramones played during their live shows would make up their 1976 debut album. All four Ramones were deeply inspired and influenced by the incessantly catchy, sweet pop epiphanies of the Phil Spector-produced girl group pop of the early 1960s, as well as the sun-kissed surfing cars, good time rock and roll of the early Beach Boys, and the melodic euphoria and guitar crunch of the early Beatles. They put all that together in a delicious pop sandwich and drenched it in a cacophony of the hardest, fastest, loudest, most rocking wall of noise concoction of guitar, bass, drums that the world had ever heard. The sheer intensity and in-your-face brashness of this new music would very soon come to be known as punk rock. No guitar solos, no bridges in the songs, no more than 4 or 5 chords, just verses and choruses. Going beyond 3 minutes in a song was forbidden. 1, 2, 3, 4, hey ho, let's go. Lyrically, it's important to note how much these guys loved comic books and horror movies. The cartoonish, over-the-top, gonzo nature of these media forms informed their overall sensibilities and how they viewed and expressed their interpretation of the world. They were in no way stupid, but they were quote-unquote dumb, in quotation marks, as in using low common denominator tools to express what most people could identify with. They weren't highbrow with lyrical metaphor or symbolism, but they were witty with their economy of words and their flair for vivid description. And that's nothing to say about how utterly dark their humor was. The song Beat on the Brat is about, well, beating on a brat with a baseball bat. What can you do with a brat like that? No, it's not your fault. It's warped and sadistic, but if you don't take it literally, it's actually kind of funny. The song Now I Want to Sniff Some Glue is about being so completely, utterly bored and disillusioned with life that there's nothing else better to do than sniff airplane glue and get high. And in the post-Vietnam War, post-Watergate climate of America at the time, hey, why not? The song I Don't Want to Go Down to the Basement is literally monster movie Fantasia straight out of Johnny Ramone's horror comic collection. Thanks to chief lyricist Joey Ramone, the resident political liberal in the band, the song Havana Affair is a sly, subtle jab at American exploitation of underdeveloped and third world countries. The song 53rd and 3rd is a harrowing story of a former Vietnam veteran turned male prostitute who pulls a knife and kills a trick, quote unquote, a customer, trying to take advantage of him and is then chased by the cops. It's all the more harrowing considering how Dee Dee Ramone actually did turn tricks for a living in order to support his heroin habit before he joined the band. The ultimate punk anthem, Blitzkrieg Bop, manages to connect the feeling of solidarity young people get from the uniting power of rock and roll with the same feeling young fascists get at a Nazi rally. But they do so with a shrugging ambiguity and a very telling, detached lack of preachiness. This is in sharp contrast to the heavy-handed, holier-than-thou, offensive pretentiousness that Roger Waters would utilize a few years later with Pink Floyd's album The Wall. The Ramones could be romantic and sweet as well, though, with gorgeous power pop songs such as Listen to My Heart, I Want to Be Your Boyfriend, and Today Your Love, Tomorrow the World. It's hard to imagine with our modern sensibilities how striking, how wild, how dangerous, and again, how utterly revolutionary the Ramones must have seemed in the mid-1970s. They weren't the first band from New York's CBGB scene, but once word of mouth of their uncompromisingly ferocious music and live shows that rarely went beyond 17 minutes spread like wildfire, they became the scene's undisputed leaders. Craig Leon, the A&R man for Sire Records, who tipped off New York music scene insiders. Oh, he was tipped off, sorry, by New York music scene insiders. Saw them in the spring of 1975 on a random night at CBGB's and was instantly smitten. He convinced Sire head honcho Seymour Stein to sign them, and Stein's wife Linda became their official manager, along with Danny Fields. With Craig Leon acting as official producer and Tommy Ramone as associate producer, meaning Tommy did the real production work, the Ramones recorded and mixed the entirety of their self-titled debut in just 7 days in January of 1976 at Plaza Sound, a recording studio located inside Radio City Music Hall. The sound of the record is as uncompromising as the band's overall music, but in a different way. With its buzzsaw guitar sound, pulsating bass lines, and stripped down, dirty, lo-fi sound, predating the sound quality of so many albums of the American underground indie alternative movement by several years, they were presenting a leather jacket-clad, ripped jeans-wearing, bowl-cut sporting middle finger to the rock music establishment that had, in their eyes, grown bloated, indulgent, stale, boring, and predictable. Here was a band that earnestly believed in the healing powers of rock and roll with an evangelical zeal and captured the youthful, wild, powerful, transcendent energy of the genre's earliest years. No, the album didn't sell well, hitting only 111 on the Billboard album charts. But the impact and importance of the Ramones' first album lies in more, so much more than just record sales. Starting in 1976, when the Ramones commenced and embarked on their first of their numerous and endless national tours, the vast majority of towns and cities they played in didn't have punk scenes. However, when the Ramones played those towns and cities would very quickly develop and grow punk scenes. And when the Ramones would return, they would have twice as many fans as before. This development was crucial in the organic grassroots growth of America's underground rock movement, a network of independent fanzines, club venues, independent radio stations, and college radio stations that were the lifeblood of punk rock as it morphed to hardcore punk, then onward to alternative rock throughout the 1980s and onward to the 1990s. None of this would have happened without the Ramones. As their careers unfolded, it became apparent that the Ramones didn't have that many tricks in their pockets when it came to musical experimentation or the pushing of musical boundaries. But you know what? When they were so colossally important and influential, it doesn't matter. All you have to do is listen to that flawlessly timeless first album to understand why. Chris?
Yeah, they were a one-trick pony, but it was one hell of a trick.
Yeah.
And it just an astonishingly great rock and roll record that it's the most rock and roll take on Baroque music imaginable.
Yeah.
These 2-minute little sweeping little ditties, but just revved up and just funk, you just fuzzed out and
Yeah.
just bashed out and just a lot of fun. The energy is unmatched. I mean, the longest song on the album is 2 minutes and 40 seconds. And, just these great little 2 minute hook filled songs, just bashed out and just, done with conviction. And it is kind of amazing how they do kind of channel the energy and the sort of the smiley energy of the girl groups and the early 60s surf rock. I mean, it
Yeah.
really is kind of extraordinary how they're able to channel that in it, but they channel it through a prism of tough guy blushing or Forest Hills, New York, kind of toughness, rawness, you
Yeah.
know, they just real rockedness that was going on there. So it just, yeah, that there is important a band as there has been. You don't really get the American rock of the last 50 years, if not for the Ramones. They kind of set the tone, they set the aesthetic,
Yeah.
that sort of DIY aesthetic, and that sort of they kind of really kind of hammered home the importance and the value and the self-esteem of being part of a scene.
Right.
That being part of the scene became a hugely important thing because of the Ramones and because of that aesthetic and because of their work. So I love that album, and Beat on the Brat is just like a perfect song because it's so dumb. And again, remember in the curmudgeonly universe, dumb is never a bad thing. Kiss, dumb band. The Ramones, dumb band, but brilliant.
And they're
Uh,
both from New York.
and they're both from New York. Just brilliant stuff, man. And like I said, Rocket to Russia is a pretty good album. And they had a couple of decent follow-ups, but they petered out by like 1980. They were pretty much done, and so they pretty much were a nostalgia band from then on.
Yeah.
Yeah, if anybody caught lightning in a bottle ever, it was the Ramones. Probably one of the 50 best albums of all time, maybe even better than that, maybe top 20 albums of all time. It's just
I'm just gonna say
extraordinary.
in my list of the 500 greatest albums ever, it is definitely in my top 50 for sure.
Yep, there you go. And so can't really talk about the Ramones without also talking about the Sex Pistols, can we?
The other big story of punk rock of this year.
Yeah, absolutely. And so punk rock became a movement that, obviously, you were it was bored kids in need of a scene and in need of relevance in their life, and to kind of stick it to the establishment. And it was prevalent on both sides of the pond. In the US, you had the Ramones and the rest of the CBGB's crowd. Over in the UK, it all starts with the mighty, mighty Sex Pistols. So let's talk a little bit about their origin story and about the 1976 that they had. So, exactly how does a guitarist who can play his ass off end up in a band with a bassist who can barely play a note? And how does the most alternatingly glib and obnoxious fellow imaginable find himself in a position to become one of rock's foremost iconoclasts? Well, chalk it up to the scenic and taste-making influence of the owner of a 1950s rock and roll revivalist clothing boutique turned sex shop in London. Malcolm McLaren was that man, and the Sex Pistols were effectively his creation. The band, with vocalist Johnny Rotten dominating the front of the stage, would take the global rock and roll scene by storm and make punk rock a genetic thing thereafter the next year in 1977. But the Sex Pistols as a band, and more importantly as a movement, their true ascension effectively occurred here in 1976.
Mm-hmm.
McLaren co-owned a shop originally called Too Fast to Live, Too Young to Die. And that began life as a tribute to the rocker look of the 1950s. The greasy leather and denim bad boy thing that was made famous in America in movies starring Marlon Brando and James Dean back in the 1950s. So that shop that McLaren owned attracted members of local bands who were gunning for a similar aesthetic, albeit louder, looser, and wilder. One of these bands that frequented the shop was known as The Strand and featured a young vocalist and guitarist named Steve Jones. McLaren, perhaps taking on the role of an oracle, assumed management of the Strand in 1974. He also took the leather fetish of the rocker look to an extreme and rechristened Too Fast to Live, Too Young to Die that year. The new name? Sex. For what it's worth, McLaren took a related detour to America around this time to manage the New York Dolls, perhaps the truest proto-punks of them all, there for a little bit of a stretch. Well, when McLaren returned to London the next year, he found that the Strand was in a transitional phase and in need of a new member. Jones, who had been singing for the Strand, chose to move full-time to guitar, where he was more comfortable, and the time came to search for a replacement singer. When Sylvain of the Dolls and also Richard Hell turned down an offer to join, can you imagine? The hunt definitely intensified. The band caught a break when one member of the band spotted a very young man named John Lydon walking down a London street wearing a Pink Floyd t-shirt that had been altered to read "I hate" in front of the Floyd logo. Following an audition process, Lydon was in the band and became known as Johnny Rotten, a reward for having ugly ass teeth. Soon, the name of the band was ingeniously changed to the Sex Pistols. There's no truly credible story regarding how they came up with that name, according to all the mythology out there. But still, that's a magnificently dirty double entendre of a moniker if there ever was one. Not surprisingly, McLaren, the astute businessman, used the Sex Pistols as a walking advertisement for the odd and out there fashions he was selling at his shop, Sex. I love it. See, he actually had a store called Sex. And in gigging around London, the looks began to catch on. Spiky hair, cut-off denim jacket, leather equipped with chains, etc., etc. A self-styled radical, McLaren also had the brilliant idea of mimicking a kidnapper's cutout collage lettering to form the band's logo. It really did look like ransom note pastiche. By February of 1976, the well-known music magazine New Musical Express was starting to pay attention to the Sex Pistols' following in shows. NME ran a review of a show complete with quotes from members of the band, and the attention it merited grew and grew some more from there. The band, that is. It grew more and more from there. By the time they had reached Manchester for a gig in June of 76, the Sex Pistols had effectively become a movement in the UK. By the next month, two other classic bands, The Clash and The Damned, according to legend, each played their first gig ever opening for the Sex Pistols. Could you imagine being in that crowd? Man,
yeah.
Holy shit. The Clash and The Damned opening for the Sex Pistols when they were still all learning how to be good bands.
You walk out of the club full of spit all over your body.
Yeah, no shit. Wow. Well, not just spit, maybe some feces too. Wow. That is some badass shit. So then next came television appearances and a broader tour of Great Britain. As the Sex Pistols ascended, so did their musical chops as they evolved from a band who could barely play into a band that killed it routinely with a tight, noisy as hell assault on audience members. By October, the label EMI had signed the band, and by the end of November, the single Anarchy in the UK had hit shelves in the airwaves. Now, let's not understate the magnitude of the dawn of Anarchy in the UK. 3 minutes and 31 seconds of pure audio dynamite. This was one of the raunchiest, gnarliest, loudest, rudest songs ever released up to that point, and its unapologetic anti-establishment bent made for a sterling rallying cry for the disaffected youth against a stodgy, ineffective government that presided over what was seen as an economic decay and hopelessness. The song
is there a better opening line in rock music history than
Hey, you're reading my script. You're reading my script. The song's opening line is perfect. I am an antichrista. I am an anarchista. That's like the most perfect opening line ever. And so was the imagery that accompanied the release of the single on vinyl, which was a Union Jack flag that appeared to be torn up and held together with safety pins. If McLaren, Jones, Rotten and Company were selling a zeitgeist, this was all a hell of a good way to do it. Anarchy in the UK reached number 38 on the British singles chart, which, with the punk idiom being so virtually brand new to the public at large, was really quite an accomplishment if you think about it, that they were able to sell that many albums, basically on a grassroots movement.
Right.
So the Sex Pistols ended their explosive year by generating some excellently great bad media with a drunken, foul-mouthed appearance that December on UK talk show Today.
You could go
Plenty
on
of,
YouTube and find it.
yeah, it's out there. Plenty of F-bombs are dropped, as was sexual innuendo involving fellow guest Susie Sue. Apparently, there was some heavy flirting and some pretty not so subtle, hey, I want to fuck you, babe, stuff going on there. The reputation was now firmly in place. The kids loved these louts, and the parents and Buckingham Palace absolutely abhorred them. The incident solidified the Sex Pistols as a household name in Britain and set the tone for the brief fit of rock domination that followed. It should be noted that the bassist that I referred to, Sid Vicious, joined the band soon after in like February or March of 1977. Boy, did he look the part. Boy, did he play the part. But boy, would he suck as a bassist. Anyway,
Their original bass player was actually really good.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like I said, they were a tight band. They were actually a pretty good band.
Their original bass player was actually really good. Glenn Matlock could actually play. And apparently the reason they let him go is he didn't get along with Johnny Rotten and,
Yeah, I was gonna say John Rotten seemed like he would have been a guy that he knew how to egg the shit out of people. He really did. He just had this real attitude. Like he was punk rock in a nutshell for sure.
Yeah.
So let's wrap it up a little bit here. The music was awesome, yes, but it was secondary to the image, the attitude, and the entry into the debate over the UK's present and future conditions. Sex Pistol might as well have been a verb and an adjective as much as it was a noun. Me personally, I'll take the adjective. Shit, let me give you a good synonym for Sex Pistol. Curmudgeon. Yep, we are carrying on the legacy of pissing off the powers that be, walking with our self-styled strut, and keeping the flame of punk and the larger movement of rock and roll alive. Hence, we give a very immense thank you to Malcolm McLaren and Johnny Rotten and all the rest of those guys. Thank you, Sex Pistols. Arturo, what's your take on the Pistols?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing how, punk rock is a music that's supposed to be wild and chaotic, and it's all about not so much improvisation, but being in the moment,
Yep.
and spontaneous. But the Sex Pistols were very calculated. Like
Yeah.
everything they did was planned. Malcolm McLaren planned everything.
Oh yeah. I mean, they were prefab to the nth. I mean, they were basically pushed to be the face of a scene and the face of a brand. I mean,
right.
basically, they were the house band for his store.
Yeah,
And that's how they started.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and the Clash, who came very soon, right? I mean, we're going to talk about them in detail in the next episode because that's when their first album came out. But the Clash were kind of like almost kind of prefabricated in their own way because they were inspired by the Pistols. They were like they were the political Sex Pistols, basically,
Yep.
But the Pistols themselves, yeah, man, you listen to and we're going to talk about it in the next segment with all these the punk rock singles of '76. How early punk rock was so raunchy and nasty, like you listen to what nowadays passes as punk rock. See, not as punk as this shit. This shit is punk.
Yeah. This shit's very punk, and just the energy of it. But the thing, I think you made the point here that for as prefab as they were, and for as illustrative of an attitude and a scene as they were, the musical chops were there. Steve Jones was a legitimately great songwriter and guitar player.
He could play guitar and he could write. Yeah, underrated in a lot of ways.
I'm saying, that album that they came out with the next year, Nevermind the Bollocks, Here Come the Sex Pistols, is fucking great.
He played the guitar and all the bass.
Yep. Yeah, I was gonna say they weren't gonna let Sid Vicious play. I'm saying he looked the part. He could help Michael McLaren sell leather, for sure. But man, eesh. But no, they were.
We'll talk more about good old Sid in the next episode of this series.
Yeah, but no, they were they were a kick-ass band, and again, it's kind of one thing I should mention too is that the Buzzcocks kind of come out of adoration for the Pistols and participation in the scene as well.
Sure, and the band that would eventually become Joy Division, they were at all four members of that band were at the 1976 Manchester show that the Sex Pistols played. So
Yeah, I
like
was going
both
to
the
say.
Buzzcocks and Joy Division came out of that show.
Yeah, well, no, but isn't that the show where like pretty much everybody who was in the audience became a member of a famous band?
Yeah,
It was like
that's not
it
the
was like
show. Yeah,
50 it was like 50 people in the crowd, and like they all ended up being in well-known bands.
yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. It was kind of like a punk pro shop you know, it's kind of extraordinary. So yeah, I could just imagine being a fly on the wall for the Clash playing their first gig
Good
ever,
Lord.
opening up for a very green Sex Pistols in like a shitty
Yeah.
club. Man,
God.
that's a story to tell your grandkids right there.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that there's some 80-year-old men out there that do tell that story.
Yeah. Although
So
they'll be 80 soon.
yeah, or they're pushing 80 now for sure. So there you go. So we have more punk to talk about, don't we?
Yes. The Ramones and the Sex Pistols may have been the two bands that officially spearheaded the punk rock movement from both sides of the Atlantic in 1976, but there were other bands throughout this very early punk rock landscape that released classic singles in this seminal year. So let's do a quick lightning round. First, The Damned with New Rose, coming from the same London scene as the Sex Pistols. And while the Pistols were lapping up all the media headlines and inspiring one budding band after another, the Damned actually released this song, their very first single, before the Sex Pistols released their first single. This whirling dervish of a track is frothy punk rock menace at its most frightening, which is all the more impressive considering that lyrically, it's basically a love song. What sets this song apart and way up on the pantheon of the pantheon of punk rock is how Rat Scabies drumming just builds and builds in intensity, going faster as the track goes along, almost recklessly going off the rails until it ends in a full stop. Another great single from London in this time, the 101ers with Keys to Your Heart. With his endearingly raspy croak of a voice and his fiercely political lyrics that managed to also be sincere in its passion, Joe Strummer is forever known as the iconic frontman for arguably the greatest punk rock band of all time, The Clash. However, briefly in the mid 1970s, he led this ragtag bar band that were part of London's pub rock scene alongside Dr. Feelgood, Ian Dury and the Blockheads, and the young Elvis Costello. Another love song done as anthemic sing-along rocker, this would be the 101ers' only release until Strummer saw the Sex Pistols live, saw the writing on the wall and where rock music was going, and quit the band to form a band called You Know Who with Mick Jones and Paul Simonon. Next, Crime with Hot Wire My Heart. While much smaller and nowhere near as impactful as what New York produced, San Francisco and the surrounding Bay Area also had a pretty fruitful punk rock scene. Crime were the leaders of this pack, and in 76 released this raucous, gloriously shambolic slice of punk fury disguised as romantic lust. The execution sounds ragged and ramshackle, but the chord progression and song structure are deceptively tight with a kick-ass chorus. An even better version would be done 11 years later by Sonic Youth. Next, you have the Vibrators with We Vibrate. Unlike the Sex Pistols and the Clash with their righteous, serious anger, the Vibrators shared the Damned's sense of sheer, rollicking rock and roll fun. This, their debut single, is loose, swinging, and slightly loopy with its sound effects. Next, you have Debris with One Way Spit. You would never think Chickasha, Oklahoma would be the home base for one of the wackiest, most out there bands of the early punk era, but here are Debris with the single from their one and only album. It's a good thing because this is a band you can probably only take in small doses. Sounding something like the Stooges on crystal meth and with the appropriate saxophone skronks to boot, the stop-start song structure and incessant riff are the only things that sound relatively tethered to the ground in this rambling piece of unhinged chaos. Can't expect much else from a band whose frontman was named Oliver Rectomo Powers. Next, Pere Ubu, Final Solution. Like with San Francisco, Cleveland also had a small but vibrant punk scene, and Pere Ubu were the band whose reputation in the underground most transcended its time. They were vaguely punk, though. In actuality, they were more like heavy art rock with detours into psychedelia. This pulsating single from 1976 is multifaceted in its dynamics, ranging from slow build-up to brooding to cathartic release to wild guitar solo. Next, Blondie with Ex Offender. Blondie came hot on the heels of the Ramones in 1975 to capture the hearts of the punkers and new wavers in New York CBGB scene with a pop rock power pop sound that shared many of the Ramones' 1960s pure pop influences. With a wonderful singer and charismatic, ravishing frontwoman like Debbie Harry, they could do no wrong. Their debut single from 1976 mixed Spectre-esque girl group pop from the early 60s with Bob Dylan's Absolutely Sweet Marie and its wild, thin Mercury sound, as well as some deceptively complex musicianship. Lyrically, it's a cheeky tale of a prostitute who falls in love with the cop who arrests her. In a few short years, they would go on to world domination. And then finally, the Runaways with Cherry Bomb. In 1975, famed Los Angeles record producer and notorious sleaze merchant Kim Fowley had the idea of forming a teenaged, all-female glam rock band. He succeeded, and while getting guitarists and future rock firebrands Joan Jett and Lita Ford to coexist in the same band was a challenge, to say the least. They were put over the top by lead singer Cherie Currie and her Bowie-esque strut and allure. It helped that they had some catchy as fuck foot-stomping rockers that just happened to fit right in with the burgeoning underground punk rock scene at the time. No song of theirs encapsulated their overall ethos like this song, Cherry Bomb, an ode to underaged, out and proud, sexually promiscuous attitude. They never really made it big in the US, but they did so in the UK and Europe, and incredibly so in Japan. Chris, punk rock single 76.
That was a good rundown, and what it shows. Well, one, there's no way in hell that the Runaways would ever they would get away with the Runaways in the Me Too era. So that's definitely a product of a bygone, sexist as hell era of this idea of basically jailbait, a jailbait punk rock band. So that's a testament to a bygone era in some ways, thank God. But what it shows is that there was just that punk was something that was spreading, that it was an aesthetic that was spreading, that the sort of DIY kind of tear your heart out, kind of romp and stomp and just scream and strut and just have that kind of loud energy. But within that, there was some diversity. Like Blondie was not the same kind of band as Debris, obviously, and the Vibrators and Pere Ubu. Pere Ubu was barely counts as a punk band with the exception of the energy. It's the energy that kind of unifies all of these, and so punk was a movement, and this was what it shows. And you had one band in L.A., another band in San Francisco, one band in Oklahoma, one band in Cleveland, one band in London, one band in New York, and so they're spread out all over the place, but they're bashing out and they're liberating themselves from the confines of the modern of what was then the modern age. And you got to remember, you're talking 1976 in a lot of these big cities, and it was a recessionary era with breakout crime. Crime was a real problem, drugs was a real problem. This was kind of the fallout of the hippie era, is that everybody got hooked on crack or on cocaine and heroin, and things were being ghettoized, and there was a feeling of hopelessness. And so there was this need and desire for transcendence. And so they were not going to wait for permission to break out and do their own thing. And so there's an anger, there's a cultural anger and angst that defines all of this. And so it's wanting to break free from what they were putting up with at the time, which is pretty bleak. You read about culture on both sides of the aisle, London, New York, and big cities in the mid 70s. It was no joke. It was tough.
Yeah.
It wasn't as it wasn't as tech bro and as kind of economically kind of cushy and segregated as now. It was just kind of people were all on top of each other, and it
Yeah.
was chaotic, and
Yeah.
it was nuts, and it was kind of a disaster. And so a lot of these bands and a lot of these young bands were just looking to survive life. And
Mm.
so that kind of defines the aesthetic. And so that's a real thing. And so really good rundown. And it just kind of shows you that the aesthetic, it ran deep and it ran diversely.
On this episode, we broke down the year zero for punk that was 1976, the first episode in our third Golden Age of Rock series. For the next episode, this podcast's resident Neil Youngologist, Curmudgeon Chris, is going to break down all 17 CDs of the third and latest of Uncle Neil's archive series. Spanning the years 1976 through 87, Young's latest and most massive installment includes complete live shows, alternate versions of previously released material, outtakes from albums, and never before released material from various studio sessions. It also stylistically runs the gamut from his peak mid-1970s period through to his early 1980s experiments with synth pop and electronica to his wacky mid-1980s obsession with rockabilly. Chris insists there's gold to be found in them there hills, and he's going to guide us to the best of all this material. Just in case you don't want to spend a fortune on all that physical media, Join us next time as the Curmudgeon Rock Report brings you the Neil Young Archives, Volume 3, a curmudgeonly review. All right, so let's move out of punk rock and let's get into the more listener-friendly confines of mainstream rock radio of 1976. And no band characterized that shit more than Boston.
Yeah,
Yes, Chris.
I can't talk about 1976 without the single biggest record of 1976, which is Boston's self-titled debut. We are on record as being fans of this album. How much we actually recorded an album almost exactly a year ago.
Yep.
We recorded an episode that basically paid loving tribute to this record. It was one of our last In Defense Of episodes, and we talked about this album. So, but let's talk about it here. In retrospect, it is kind of funny that Boston broke out in the same year that punk did, right?
Yeah.
And after all, the smashing success of Boston's self-titled debut record from 76 provided what eventually became the cliche for big, annoyingly juiced-up arena rock that you figure punk was railing against. That basically punk was sort of the anti the man. Well, Boston, they didn't set out to become the man, but within 10 years, that was the man right there.
Yeah.
So, but you know what? Sort of fuck what? Boston's Boston is a fabulous rock record. And like I said, we dedicated an entire episode of this podcast to it about a year ago. It's one of rock's most fabled DIY accomplishments. Amazingly, that album was largely recorded and produced in the basement of a suburban Boston home owned by band founder and resident genius Tom Schultz, who worked as an engineer for Polaroid while he moonlighted as an aspiring rock god off the clock. The man was no mere hobbyist, though. He got more mileage out of guitar and vocal overdubbing than someone with slightly less than state-of-the-art recording equipment should have. So, Schultz, in fact, was so good at what he did at manning those boards that the band was able to pull a fast one on its label, Epic Records. The label forced the band, as one of the conditions of signing them, to use a Los Angeles studio as part of making the record. But Schultz effectively did most of the real work from that same basement studio back in Boston, while his bandmates mostly hung out in that aforementioned studio and laid down an occasional vocal or two. So basically, Schultz was just a basement dweller, and they would feed him some of the stuff that they were doing out there, and he would just run it into what he was doing. And so, from what I understand, the actual album was not a whole lot different than the demo, and so it featured the same kind of studio trickery and was run through the same board. So really not much difference. So if you figure the results, given the context, are stunning. An 8-song suite so magnificent that to this day, all 8 songs remain in heavy rotation on classic rock radio stations across the United States. Heck, I just heard the Groove-tastic banger foreplay / long time in my car just yesterday. Like seriously, it came on. It was like you can't avoid it. It's like, it's like the plague. It never goes away. I
Right.
mean, bag on arena rock all you want, but if every single song on your best album is a radio staple, then you've definitely done something right. Now,
Yeah.
more about those songs. They definitely transcend the cliche they came to embody. These are soulful, honestly rendered, super energetic anthems that benefit from all the textures and layers that Schultz lays down. These are big, meaty songs done bigly and meatily. Singer Brad Delp's vocals are solid throughout and at times are extraordinary, especially on the album's biggest hit, More Than a Feeling, on which Delp's near falsetto hits us right in the nuts with its sincerity. And personally, I can't slag any album that features not one, but 2 awesome clavinet solos. Check out especially the clavinet solo on the hard drive and Smokin', which, yes,
Yeah.
is about that kind of smoking. These guys were not all that square, it turns out. Even the least played of these songs overall, Something About You, is a killer, assaulting us with seemingly countless lead guitars thundering down an electrifying motif. Neat feat, yo. So there you go. The least punk thing about 1976 and the subsequent history book renderings of 1976 was pretty fucking great, and a real testament to the glory of rock and roll at its slickest and grandest. Boston, the album, is certified 17 times platinum by the Recording Industry Association of America, tying with Alanis Morissette's Jagged Little Pill, Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA, and several other titles as the 11th best-selling record of all time in the U.S. Boston did something very, 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 very right in 1976. Long live Boston's Boston. No irony there, right, Arturo?
Yeah. For those of you who hate Boston, always remember the main riff of More Than a Feeling is the basis for the opening riff of Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit.
Which Kurt Cobain admitted.
In which he admitted he stole it. And he said, yeah, I stole it from Boston. So if you hate Boston, you may not want to hate them anymore if you're a Nirvana fan.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. So the other band of 1976 that isn't punk that were pretty important, the Eagles. A couple of years ago, we fiercely defended the legacy of the Eagles in an episode called, well, In Defense of the Eagles.
By far our most popular episode, by the way. So
really?
Go check it out.
I did not know that. All right.
Yeah.
Since their album Hotel California is not only one of the truly epochal albums of the 1970s, but one of the greatest albums of all time, any discussion of the year 1976 requires not just a discussion of this record, but another curmudgeonly defense of it. But before we do that, let's put things into perspective and take a look at where the Eagles were in their career trajectory at the time of the album's release in late 76. They were definitely the biggest band in America at the time, and looking at chart success alone, you can arguably say they were the band of the decade, at least in the US.
Yep.
Let's look at their Billboard Top 40 singles chart placings up to 1976. 1972, Take It Easy at number 12, Witchy Woman at number 9, Peaceful Easy Feeling at number 22. 1973, oddly enough, their album of this year, Desperado, yielded no real hit singles, although Tequila Sunrise and the song Desperado, the latter thanks to Linda Ronstadt's beautiful cover of it at the time, both became concert staples and canonical entries in the band's catalog. 1974, Already Gone at number 32, and Best of My Love as their first entry at number 1. 1975, One of These Nights as their second number 1, Lion Eyes at number 2, and Take It to the Limit, my personal favorite Eagles song, at number 4. Those are some Beatlesque numbers and a testament to how ubiquitous the Beatles were, the Eagles were not just on album-oriented rock radio, but the pop radio format as well. In fact, in February 1976, they released a compilation called Their Greatest Hits, 1971 to 1975, that went straight to number one on the Billboard album chart, would go on to sell over 5 million copies, and would go on to be the biggest selling American album in history until
Yep.
Michael Jackson's Thriller eclipsed it in the mid 1980s.
And then,
So,
but in the streaming era, the Eagles are back out on top, and they're now 38 times platinum. So
geez.
they're the number one seller of all
Wow.
time.
Wow. Holy cow. So you can imagine when the band were about to drop Hotel California toward the end of 1976, it was Eaglemania in America, and they were already a headlining arena rock act. When it did drop, yes, it was a blockbuster and one of the biggest selling albums of the entire decade. But more than that, it was an artistic statement. As an artistic statement that Hotel California has endured, and why to this day it's still included in pretty much any music media list of the greatest albums of all time. There's an epic lushness and a grandeur to these songs that consolidate all the elements of the Eagles sound that made them great. The gorgeous vocal harmonies, the perfect country rock song constructions of Don Henley and Glenn Frey, the intertwining guitar tapestries of Don Felder and by now Joe Walsh, Henley's hyper-literate lyrics of doomed romantic dysfunction, and yet also expand on those elements and their overall signature style. While it isn't a concept album with a clear, direct narrative, it is a song cycle about the decadent, reckless, empty lives of middle-class Los Angelinos in the post-hippie, post-free love idealism world of the 1970s, all told via the astute, sometimes jaded, sometimes compassionate viewpoint of the Henley Frey songwriting duo. And no, this doesn't make it just an album of its time or stuck in its time. It's a cultural snapshot of an important and interesting time in American social history that produced echoes that resonated in the decades that followed, thereby making it timeless in its own way. As Don Henley once said in an interview, it's taking the American dream for what it is, then turning it upside down and taking a look at its dark, grim underbelly. You don't need me to tell you anything about the song Hotel California itself, the Eagles' signature song and one of the grandest, most epic rock songs of all time, complete with dueling guitar leads in its opulent crescendo. A bluegrass-based finger exercise Joe Walsh used to warm up before practices and gigs serves as the unlikely yet kick-ass opening riff to Life in the Fast Lane, a song that at first seems to offer a scintillating peek into what the title suggests, but ends up being an emotional cautionary tale of excess. New Kid in Town is a beautiful slice of country pop. Victim of Love rocks with a heaviness that proved they belong in the 1970s arena rock circuit. And Wasted Time and the gorgeous Waltz Time Pretty Maids All in a Row are proof that the Eagles could write ballads as well or better than any artist of this era. And the climactic track, the epic orchestral sweep of The Last Resort, sounds at first like a history of America's population expansion into the West Coast, especially in regard to Southern California. A closer listen reveals it to actually be Don Henley's commentary on gentrification and the societal, cultural, political, and environmental costs of it all. It's a perfect album and the apotheosis of the Laurel Canyon-based Southern California singer-songwriter movement that kicked off the 1970s. Oh yeah, as for those Billboard Top 40 singles chart placings, New Kid in Town at number 1, Hotel California at number 1, duh, and Life in the Fast Lane at number 11. Chris?
Yeah, this is your band on Joe Walsh. Yeah, he upped the game for them, especially, and also worth noting, R.I.P. J.D. Souther, who co-wrote New Kid in Town with Glenn Frey. So, yeah, this is a perfect album. I've always been a huge fan of The Last Resort. I've always been a huge fan of Wasted Time. There's just a lot of lovely, lovely stuff on this record, and it really is thematically rich. I think the Eagles are, because the Eagles have a reputation for self-serious pomposity.
Yeah.
But they did actually have a lot to say, and were thoughtful in how they did it. And they were more literate than they give credit for. I mean, they first showed they were capable of this kind of thing with Desperado a few years
Right.
earlier, but then they really kind of brought it home with the sort of the basically the deconstruction and demythologicalization of California and of
Yeah.
LA, and they do it beautifully. So, and then again, having Joe Walsh to be next to Don Felder as
Yeah.
two guys who could really just crank it. And
Right.
Walsh was just a guitar playing savant. That guy was great,
Mm.
and obviously one of rock's great preeminent wild men. So
Yeah.
obviously he upped the attitude of the music. So just a perfect testament to the era, a perfect testament to the power of pop music, and just one of my favorite albums of all time. Actually, it was actually the first album when in Christmas of 1990.
Mm.
As a Christmas gift, got my first boombox, CD boombox, and it was
Mm.
the first time I'd ever owned CDs. And the first two CDs that I owned were the White Album
Hmm.
and Hotel California. I got that
Yeah.
as a Christmas gift from my mom. So basically, Hotel California was one of my first two ever albums on CD. And
Mm.
so
Wow.
I go back a long way with this album for
Wow.
sure.
All right. So we go from the Eagles to the singular artist who pretty much the solo artist who defined the 1960s, had a bit of a rough patch in the early 70s, but boy, did he bounce back in the mid 1970s.
Yeah, we're
Chris?
talking about Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan had a hell of a 75, and he followed it up with a hell of a 76. So,
Yeah.
so let's talk about Mr. Dylan and his album Desire. Bob Dylan entered 1976 on a pretty triumphant run. He had released his best album in nearly a decade in 1975, the unbelievably moving and compelling Blood on the Tracks, an album that was immediately and universally deified by critics and common folk listeners alike. He had also hit the road and unleashed his Rolling Thunder Revue, in which Dylan, usually adorned in garish stage makeup, shook up his catalog and practically punked it up in its presentation. The tour
Yeah.
was something to talk about indeed. If it hadn't have been for Mr. Bruce Springsteen, Dylan would have been the undisputed king of 1975. Well, how to follow all of that greatness up? Well, with more greatness, which, given how sharply Dylan had fallen off from his legendary 1960s run, was far from a guarantee. For all anyone knew, things might devolve quickly once again into more self-portrait style nonsense and Quinn the Eskimo brand bullshit. But nope, Dylan hit the gas pedal in 1976 immediately, releasing his album Desire that January. The album, famous for containing the eternal college bar sing-along The Hurricane, may be Dylan's most underrated. As it stands here in the mid-2020s, the album is actually at risk of falling into the dustbin of history. Though the album placed at number 174 on the 2012 edition of Rolling Stone's list of the 500 greatest albums of all time, it actually fell off the list completely in 2020. So it went from 174 to not even being on the list.
Fucking travesty. It really
Yeah, I know.
is.
And 174 is pretty on point, actually. And
Yeah.
sure, the voting populace might have changed radically in those 8 years, but that's still a pretty ludicrous fate
Yeah.
for this tremendous album. And that's especially so considering the album's indisputable strength. Dylan co-wrote the album, like most of the songs on the album, with New York dramaturgist Jock Levy. And the album benefits from the narrative punchiness that Levy infuses into the mix. Desire features some of Dylan's best story songs, most especially the awesomely great Isis, which may be the best combo of rocking beat and lyrical profundity in Dylan's entire catalog.
Mm.
It also features the album, that is. It also features the amazing violinist Scarlett Rivera, whose
Yeah.
lyrical playing adds both texture and drama to all of these arrangements. What's striking about Desire is its relative lack of quirkiness, which up
Mm.
until then had practically defined the musical stylings of Dylan. He plays it straight here, even singing for real on songs like the rousing Mozambique and the haunting One More Cup of Coffee, the
Yeah.
latter featuring backing vocals by country chanteuse Emmylou Harris. After the soul torture that the visitation of the breakup of his marriage that Blood on the Tracks must have represented, Dylan, it seems, just wanted to rock and spin a few good yarns. And he does so magnificently, of course, on Desire, and thankfully so, as he segued into his ill-driven born-again Christian phase starting the next year, which triggered 2+ decades of hopeless mediocrity. Desire marked the last time that Bob Dylan was truly great for another 25 years. It's a special album that deserves its props. Please, please, please restore this album to its rightful place on the 500 greatest list next time, Rolling Stone voters. Please, please, please. Arturo, what say you about Desire?
Yeah, there's an outtake from Desire called Abandoned Love that I was turned on to not too long ago by one of our listeners. And it's a fabulous song. It's honestly the only Duff track on this album is the very last track, Sarah, the song he wrote about his wife. It's
Yeah.
a little too on the nose. It's a little too sentimental and maudlin. Had he replaced Sarah with Abandoned Love, which is a much better track, I would give this the full 5-star treatment, as opposed to the 4.5 that I gave it. But yeah, I still love it. But if out there, if you love Desire, the album, go listen to the outtake from this outtake, Abandoned Love. Lyrically, basically, it's love will tear us apart. It's basically, our love for each other is so strong that it just overwhelms us and we can't be together.
Mhm.
Which is a hell of a theme. And
Yeah.
yeah, there's very little I can add to Desire. There've been some great covers of it. The White Stripes
Oh, yeah.
covered one more cup of coffee quite often. There've been some other covers on this, but that I'm kind of not remembering right now. But that's the most that's the most telling one that I can think of. But yeah, if you love Desire, go check out the outtake, Abandoned Love. Beautiful, beautiful country rock song.
Yeah, and do yourself a favor and go listen to ISIS anyway, because that's one
Yeah.
of Dylan's 10 best songs, in my
Right.
opinion. And that
Yeah.
song is just extraordinary because it's funny, but also profound and really just moving, and the violin just adds so much to it. It's
Yeah.
fucking great.
Oh, another great cover from this album. Andrew Bird and Nora O'Connor collaborated on a cover of Oh Sister that is also just gorgeous.
Okay,
So check that out.
definitely check that out.
Right. Now, next, another towering figure of 1970s rock, David Bowie. Now, Bowie once said that he didn't remember recording Station to Station, the album, because of how ripped on cocaine he was at the time. Well, that's too bad because Station to Station really is one of the most pivotal albums in the legendary man's discography, and in my opinion, one of the greatest albums of all time. The previous year, Bowie reinvented himself for about the third or fourth time in under a decade, taking on the persona of a smooth-voiced, blue-eyed soul singer with the album Young Americans, where he produced his version of Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff's sensuous Philadelphia R&B, soul, and funk. It gave him his first U.S. #1 hit, the art-damaged funk workout and John Lennon collaboration, Fame. Ever consumed with restless artistic energy as well as that all-consuming cocaine addiction, Bowie was ready to move on to another chapter in his illustrious catalog. What came from the recording sessions that spanned from September to November 1975 was actually a transitional record, the midway point between the plastic soul of Young Americans and a totally new sonic direction and landscape that would not only define Bowie's music for the rest of the decade, but prove to be one of his most influential periods. Bowie lays it bare and out in the open on the album's very first track, the epic 10-minute length title track, Station to Station. What starts as whooshing electronic noise reminiscent of the German art rock band Neu gives way to an off-kilter, mid-tempo lurch, not unlike what the German prog rock band Faust were known for. Yes, folks, Bowie was already digging into krautrock.
Yep.
At roughly the 5-minute mark, the track launches into a supple disco rock groove as it jams along. It's one of the most spellbinding and riveting moments of his entire discography. Golden Years, the album's big single and another US and UK top 10 pop hit for
Love that
Bowie,
song.
is one of Bowie's very best dance songs, a disco funk hybrid so funky and so soulful that he performed it live on Soul Train, a music variety show that came, well, he really lip synced it more than
Yeah, I was going to say nobody sang on Soul Train.
Yeah, it was a music variety show that catered to African American audiences and overall black music. With TVC 15, Bowie takes the jaunty yet skewered art pop that Brian Eno did in his early solo work and somehow makes it funky and groovy, and also one of the most innovative and original singles in his discography. Bowie flirted heavily with Isaac Hayes style blaxploitation soundtrack music a couple of years earlier on his Diamond Dogs album, but he takes it on full bore with a harder rock edge on Stay. And he retains his knack for reinventing Philly soul in his image with the gorgeous, almost erotic romanticism of Wild as the Wind and Word on a Wing. After the record's release in January 1976, Bowie would embark on a huge arena tour that would encompass North America, the UK, and Europe. And it was on this tour where Bowie introduced his iconic thin white Duke persona and outfit. But it's the album Station to Station itself that stands as a testament to how on it he was throughout this entire decade. Only Neil Young could probably challenge him for the title of solo rock artist of the decade. Chris?
Yeah, that's a pretty fair statement. Bowie was awesome through the entire 70s, and this was a pivot record. But
yeah,
if this is a pivot record, God.
yeah.
Could you imagine? You have Station to Station. He's pivoting from Young Americans to Low, and so your pivot record is better than the album that you're pivoted from.
Yeah,
and almost as good as the album that you pivoted to.
Yeah.
So this is kind of like a singular standalone album for Bowie, where he's experimenting with all kinds of stuff that,
Right.
Obviously, like you said, he has his first flirtation with the Germans, which went, full bore the next year and for the next several years. And I've always been a huge fan of TVC 15.
TVC 15, Chris. TVC 15.
Okay. 15. Yeah. Okay.
That's the song. He sings it. TVC 15. Oh.
Yep. And so I've always been a huge fan of that. Obviously the title track is just an awesome experience. It's just a thrilling 10 minutes, and there's just an aesthetic to the record. And then Golden Years is just wonderful. Golden Years makes me think of the old movie A Knight's Tale. You remember that movie?
Yeah.
It's an underrated film because everybody in the film knows they're making a bad movie, which is what makes it so great. But the idea of having a courtship dance in royal, like 16th century Britain to Golden Years is just a wonderful idea. Because that probably would have been the bad boy naughty music of the day.
Yeah.
So just good stuff. And so a lot of people think it's his best record. It and in some best of all time records, it tends to place pretty highly or higher than you might think. I've seen some lists where it even places in the top 50.
Wow.
So there is a cult out there that loves Station to Station, right. And I think it stands as one of Bowie's 5 best records. It really is quite strong. And hey, if this is a pivot, wow, that's just some scary shit right there.
Well, so we go from a pivot to basically the exclamation point and final album, the climax of a golden run by another genius of the 1970s. Chris, tell us about Stevie Wonder.
Yeah, this is Stevie Wonder's Songs in the Key of Life, which is one of the great double albums in the history of popular music.
There are a lot of great double albums out there.
Yes, there are, and this might be the best in all of R&B, though, in all of black music. It's pretty extraordinary. So let's talk about it. Stevie Wonder's magnum opus, Songs in the Key of Life, is built around the theme of urgency, and the execution of that theme is unbelievably, magnificently awesome. Love really is in need of love today, as the doo-wop harmony vocals and opening conga backdrop of the album's gorgeous opening song makes clear. And memories fade, but the feelings never do, as the brilliantly funky I Wish makes clear. And it probably would be better to live on Saturn and live to age 205 instead of putting up with the brutal complexities of the ghetto, as Wonder ponders on the song Saturn. But even if history is rough, the here and now doesn't have to be. We must all move on. That is the message of Pastime Paradise, known more commonly as the source sample for Coolio's mid-90s hit Gangsta's Paradise.
Yep.
Songs in the Key of Life is a brilliant tribute to everything that matters and everything we can't avoid and actually never want to avoid. Love, music, heartbreak, fatherhood, history, the poetry among the rubble, all of it. It all unfolds majestically over 2 albums, 21 songs, and 165 minutes. I actually got that wrong. It's 105 minutes.
Mm.
Okay, it's 105 minutes, an hour and 45 minutes. Behold the awesome horn arrangement that drives Sir Duke, which is a tribute to Duke Ellington and old school black big band music. Marvel at the disco beat that drives the best thing that ever happened to liberal social studies teachers, the rousing roll call of inventors of all colors and creeds called Black Man. Drop your jaw as the electric piano twinkles and the backup singers trip with joy on the chorus to the second album half stand out as, which is just an amazing song. Stevie Wonder, who was a teen star in the 1960s for Motown, had himself an extraordinary decade of the 1970s, and Songs in the Key in Life is the culmination of his efforts. It's the peak where a master craftsman truly does master his craft. I personally think it's the best of his majestic run of 1970s albums, but I won't argue with you too much if you prefer Inner Visions or Talking Book or Fulfilling in this first finale.
I go with Inner Visions myself. But
okay, but no, it's Songs in the Key of Life. But we're talking about degrees of perfect here after all. So, you're in your right to disagree, but I think it's this one. But I'll take Songs in the Key of Life because it's a veritable doctoral thesis set to music. Its sweep of emotions, life scenarios, arguments, statements, soundscape images, and instrumental moonshots is astonishing. By the time we reach beautiful instrumental album closer, Easy Going Evening Call, by the time we reach beautiful instrumental album closer, Easy Going Evening, My Mama's Call, we've experienced just about everything. All tempos, all moods, from the organic to the hyper-synthesized and back again. Ultimately, there's just an inescapable joy to these proceedings. Arturo is fond of saying that we should never discount double albums, for quite often they prove over time to be a musical act's best work. That especially holds true among the greats. Arguments can be made that the best albums from the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, The Who, and several other bands are their 2 vinyl volleys. The same holds true for Wonder, as Songs in the Key of Life never wanes in its ambition or its consistent grasp on greatness. The sonics are immediate. The voice is authoritative. Life is sweeter for having lived it in Wonder's world, and we get the message loud and clear here. Urgency indeed. The album placed at number 4 on Rolling Stone's 2020 edition of its 500 greatest albums ever made list, and that's about right in my opinion. Stevie is a genuine rock and R&B god, and this album solidifies that status. Arturo?
I don't have it at number 4. I have it more in the 30s, to be honest with you. I still have the Ramones album ahead of that one. But anyway, here's the thing about this record. This is his last truly great album.
Yes.
He never made anything close to being as good since.
No,
Hotter Than July from 1980 is a solid record. And then he spent the rest of the 80s doing corny pop, Part-Time Lover, I Just Called to Say I Love You, that crappy piece of shit he did with Paul McCartney, Ebony and Ivory, like Wonder in the 80s kind of became a joke, even though he had hit singles. As an artist, he kind of became a joke. But like this was his last volley of greatness. And it's a hell of a volley. But it's impressive. I don't know about impressive, but it's interesting to know just how low he fell off after this album, which is a shame because he was a genius.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, this was the culmination of this is what he had been spending the entire 70s building up to make this kind of statement, to have this kind of confidence. He was in the zone. He had so much to say and so many ways to say it, and just as an arranger, I mean, the way that he uses synthesizer. I mean, the snap of the drums,
Yeah.
The way he does the vocal overdubs to do the harmonies, just the joy and just his mastery of rhythm. I mean, there's some stuff that approaches disco on this record that's more competent than almost anything that the disco people did.
Yeah.
I mean, like I
Yeah.
said, a Black Man is just about as good at disco as anything that we covered on the last episode.
Right.
Just
Right.
really, really, really great stuff. Although, but he gets a little corny when it gets into Black history and it gets into ghetto stuff,
Mm.
but it's forgivable corniness because it's so sincere and so joyful. You know what
Mm.
I mean? Chris here again. We usually end our episodes by inviting you to join our Curmudgeonly community page on Facebook. Well, we're picking up our efforts there. Know people just as passionate as us about rock and roll? Invite them to join in the fun. You don't actually need our permission to do so. Also, expect to see a lot more content up there moving forward. Our mission is to engage you, so darn it, we'll engage you like a fire hose, or maybe like a firehouse if we're going to give love to Gene Simmons. We may also be making a few offers. Want to wear a t-shirt featuring our logo? You may have that opportunity soon. So be a fellow curmudgeon, help us expand our little community, and share your own musings via your own posts. We're at facebook.com/groups/curmudgeonrock.
We've talked a lot about some great, probably the best albums of 1976, but there are more. So we're going to do a little quick lightning round of 10 albums and we're going to talk about them briefly and why you guys, all of you people listening, should check them out. Chris, the first one is an album that actually came out in 1975. Tell us
Yep.
why we're talking about it in 76.
Yeah, so we're cheating a bit here. The first Fleetwood Mac album. Let me finish the sentence. So this is the first Fleetwood Mac album featuring the superstar couple Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks.
Right.
And so it's a self-titled album. It was actually released in the summer of 1975, but to very little fanfare. But what happened was it slowly built up its following and found its way to the radio. And as the calendar turned to 76, it got to the point where its popularity kept ascending.
Right.
And by that summer, they were getting on the Billboard charts with the singles Rhiannon and Say You Love Me, both of which peaked at number 11 on the Billboard Hot 100. And by September of 1976, the album reached number 1 on the Billboard 200 albums chart. So yes, more than a year after 58 weeks it had been out before it reached number 1 on the Billboard 200 albums charts, which back then, I mean, that might be slow now, but back then that might as well have been 10 years.
Yeah.
So that's pretty extraordinary the way it went. So they first made their mark as a fivesome in 76. So that success was well earned for founding members Mick Fleetwood and John McVie, and it was well deserved actually. Fleetwood Mac originally formed amid the London white boy blues rock scene of the 1960s and was initially led creatively by eccentric guitar genius Peter Green. After Green melted down on drugs and left the band, it meandered for several years trying to find a winning combination of artists that would propel it to more success. And while John McVie's wife Christine joined the band during the early 70s and immediately upped the pop craftsmanship displayed by the band, it wasn't until they hooked up with the rising Los Angeles duo of Buckingham and Nicks that they found their truly winning pop formula. This version of the band represented a rebirth, hence the self-titled release on its maiden voyage as a fivesome. They just were Fleetwood Mac. And this was the best version of Fleetwood Mac. And the studio-born results were sublime. Buckingham, Nicks, and Christine McVie, gave the band a formidable trio of hit-capable songwriters, and making capable hits they indeed did. Buckingham also excelled as a producer and an arranger. He's one of rock's true geniuses, and he lends a sheen and a mystery and a glory to these songs that they otherwise might not have had. Beyond the big hits, other highlights include McVie's ballad Over My Head and the rollicking McVie Buckingham collaboration World Turning, which features marvelous lead guitar lines from the preternaturally gifted Buckingham. This album was a definite harbinger of the glorious heights that were to come for this band, but that's something we'll cover in our 1977 episode, right, Arturo?
Oh yeah. Listen, for quite a while, for several years, among the cool indie hipster set of music fans, there was always this love for the Peter Green era. Oh, Peter Green era Fleetwood Mac is better, is cooler.
It's not
Okay,
better,
yeah,
but it's pretty damn good.
it's all right, but here's the thing. Peter Green wasn't a very good songwriter. And
Yeah,
the
he
best
was.
song and the best song he wrote was done better by Santana in Black Magic Woman,
No, oh well was pretty fucking great. Come on.
I mean, but nowhere near
Yeah.
as good as Lindsey Buckingham. He doesn't come
Well,
close
no,
to
of course
songwriting.
not. I mean,
He
Buckingham was
made
orthodox. Peter Green was unorthodox.
yeah, but
Buckingham was the epitome of orthodox.
Buckingham was a Beatles and Beach Boys fan. That's where he got his songwriting chops from. And
And
thanks
yep,
in recent years to TikTok and placement and licensing and other commercials,
they've made a
this version
comeback.
of Fleetwood Mac is now revered by younger generations of music fans,
Yeah,
and rightfully
absolutely.
so.
Yeah, Dreams was like a top 10 hit 4 years ago, isn't it? I
Yeah,
remember during the COVID lockdown, it became a big hit because it
right,
went viral on TikTok as the
right.
backing track for some skateboarder drinking cranberry ocean spray. It was really kind of ridiculous, but hey, yeah, so is the modern world. But yeah, this is definitely the best version of the band, and this album is really really strong. I love World Turning. That's always
Yeah,
been
it's a
my
great
favorite
song.
song from that. Just great. I
Sure.
mean, there's a live version of it out there that
Mm,
people should check out on YouTube. That's just awesome.
yeah,
Like the way that Buckingham like tears into that. I mean, Buckingham's a finger picker too, and
yeah.
so watching him play guitar is something because man, that guy must have had calluses of steel with the way that he could shred a fretboard while finger
Yeah,
picking.
yeah, totally.
So good
All
stuff.
right. The next great album, and this is a pet of mine. This is one of my personal favorites. The Rolling Stones, Black and Blue. Among some music fans and some critics, there seems to be this narrative surrounding the Rolling Stones that everything after Exile on Main Street sucked. Not only is that lazy journalism and objectively wrong, but it also shows bad taste. Post Exile, the Stones continued making albums that ranged from very good to downright brilliant all the way through 1981. Perhaps the most overlooked of these is this nugget from 1976. On this record, the Stones dive deeper into funk and R&B soul than ever before, with or like what became known, not rhythm and blues R&B, like African American funky R&B than ever before, with a healthy dose of some beautiful ballads. Fool to Cry and Memory Hotel are among the finest and most moving of the ballads that the band ever wrote. Hey Negrita is filthy funk at its nastiest, and the elliptical funk of Hot Stuff is just plain hypnotic. Chris?
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of this album, and part of that just because I'm a huge fan of the Mick Taylor version of the Rolling Stones. Uh, there's basically virtually been nothing better than the Mick Taylor version of the Stones. Think about it: Sticky Fingers, Exile on Main Street, and then one of the most underrated albums of all time. It's Only Rock and Roll.
Right.
And so for them to lose Mick Taylor and replace him with Ronnie Wood, who basically is a Keith Richards clone, who basically was just another rhythm player. I mean, his lead guitar work basically amounted to just kind of like in the crack slide work. I mean,
Yeah.
he's really not much. He wasn't much of a soloist and was just sort of like an extra rhythm player. So they were a different band, and they weren't as good a band. And so, Fool to Cry, good song. And yeah, Jagger, went into his soul and disco dance boy phase in these next couple of records. They came back stronger with Some Girls, and they kind of
Mhm.
found their kind of rhythm juggernaut thing. They were still kind of finding their way with Ronnie Wood, and not always successfully on this record. So to me, this is like a 3.5 star record. It was a big drop off from It's Only Rock and Roll. But again, some of the funk stuff is admirable, and it was a harbinger of the better stuff to come on the next few records. Like, by the way, as I've gotten older, I've become a huge fan of Undercover of the Night.
That's so corny.
It's a fun record. It's a fun record. I mean, it's corny as hell, but it's fun. Undercover of the Night. Yeah.
Well, speaking of band that reached their peak, the next album, Chris, tell us.
Yeah, Aerosmith with Rocks. Now,
Yeah.
most of us think of Aerosmith as the giant, shameless sellout pop metal act that helped define late 80s and early 90s MTV rock. But well before they were bowing to the money gods and covering an insipid Diane Warren ballad for the 1998 blockbuster film Armageddon, Aerosmith was once upon a time a pretty killer, kick-ass rock and roll band. They could write, they could play, and they could bash the fuck out. And they did so delectably well in 1976 on their album Rocks, the follow-up to their 1975 classic Toys in the Attic. The follow-up to that awesome rock nugget did not disappoint, suffering virtually no drop-off in quality. Lead song Back in the Saddle, which at one point, not as much anymore, but it was a classic rock radio staple, features one of the best riffs and one of the best bass grooves in all of mid-70s AOR rock. Last Child doesn't lag far behind, driven as it is by a surprisingly funky stomp. Most surprising is the sweet swinging bucket of Cheers, Sick as a Dog, which proved Aerosmith could garage rock with the best of them back in the day. This is the Aerosmith I wish more people revered. Hey, I like Loving an Elevator as much as the next guy, but come on.
I don't.
I love that song, but come on. That was some seriously slick commodification right there.
Yeah.
But until the mighty dollar bill took over, Aerosmith was the real deal, brah. Right?
They were. And the amazing thing about Aerosmith is how much they dropped off after this album. Yeah, they did it a little too much. They overdid the drugs, and their music completely sucked after this album. Then they got off drugs and had their 1980s MTV reinvention, and the music still sucked. They should have gotten back on drugs.
Like I said, they had a couple of decent songs, and granted, you know that they use song doctors to kind of up their game a little bit, but like Ragdoll is a killer rock single. Lovin' an Elevator is classic because it's so dumb. It's so dumb and so dopey and so dirty, but so fun. But it pales in comparison to the stuff they were doing in the mid-70s when, again, like, you know, between like the stuff, the first couple songs on this record and Sweet Emotion. I mean, that's a trio of songs right there. That's just kick ass.
Yeah, totally.
Big time.
Yeah. All right. Speaking of kick ass, another favorite of mine, Bob Seger with Night Moves. Now, Bob Seger had been kicking around since the late 1960s with little to no chart success, but a huge reputation as a terrific live act. His breakthrough finally came in April 1976 with his live album, Live Bullet, recorded the previous year at Detroit's Cobo Hall, broke the Billboard Top 40, or broke into it. Later in 76, he put out Night Moves, the album that made his career by having some of his biggest hits and most beloved songs. The wistful spaciness of the title track may have been phony Van Morrison, but it was good phony Van Morrison.
Oh, it's really good phony Van Morrison.
Yeah. Rock and Roll Never Forgets and The Fire Down Below are heartland rock of the finest variety. No wonder they still get rotation on classic rock radio. And Main Street, with its gorgeous lead guitar line, is just blissful, moderate rock to drive and drift down the highway to. Chris?
Yeah, a couple of things about Seger. Thank God he broke out in the 70s and not in the 80s, because ugly motherfuckers could have never done anything on MTV. He was too ugly for MTV. And so he got big in the right decade, but really talented guy. And he must really resent Boston, because he would have been the classic rock king of 1976, because this album's got 9 songs on it, and 5 of them are staples on classic rock radio. Right. Rock and Roll Never Forgets, Come to Papa, The Fire Down Below, Night Moves, and Main Street. Are all basically staples of classic rock radio, especially Night Moves these days. That's the one you hear the most these days. Come to Papa's died down a little bit. That you used to hear that a lot more, like 20-something years ago. But so 5 out of 9 doesn't beat 8 out of 8. you just can't beat 8 out of 8. But anyway, great album. Seger's a very underrated songwriter, hugely talented guy, and a big influence on of all people, Kid Rock, who is who before he degenerated into what he is now, this Trumpista, actually had a streak in the early aughts where he wrote some really great country-ish kind of classic rock type of songs. And Seeger was a big influence on Kid Rock.
Yeah, well, they're both from Detroit. All
Yep.
right, next, probably the last great album by a great artist who also kind of like, descended into crap later on. Chris, tell us about Frank Zappa.
Yep, Frank Zappa. From his breakout in the mid 1960s on through the early 1970s, Frank Zappa walked a fine line between being wink wink smart humorist on the one end and prodigious composer and player of some seriously complex music on the other. He had created We're Only in It for the Money, which was genuinely well done satire, and he had also created Hot Rats, which is one of my favorite albums of mostly instrumental jams ever. By the late 1970s, the sophomoric humor side of Zappa had started to win out, which wasn't necessarily the best outcome. 1976's Zoot Allures had self-descriptive titles on it like Wind Up Working in a Gas Station, Ms. Pinky, Find Her Finer, and Disco Boy, the latter of which is incredibly homophobic. Hey, hey, turn it up, butthead. But Zappa, the composer, hadn't completely left the picture, which is this album's saving grace. Check out the epic guitar workout Black Napkins, which is a dizzying slice of bluesy rock. Similarly, there's the glorious title track, which again features Zappa's beyond brilliant axe wielding. The song actually counts as something of a mood piece, as it seems to flutter along in a mid-tempo groove, aided by a soothing bass line. Good stuff. What do you say, Art?
Yeah, I mean, what I love about this album is how guitar heavy it is. It's just a four-piece. It's guitar, bass, drums, and a few keyboards. Zappa's always been at his best when he just shut the fuck up and played guitar.
Yep. He actually had an album called a series of albums called Shut Up and Play Your Guitar.
Yeah, it's all his guitar solos, right? All put together. Yeah, this is his last really good album before he delved into serious, stupid toilet humor. And frankly, I think it's one of the reasons why Zappa isn't as fondly remembered by younger music fans. That's true. Because of the misogyny and the homophobia really marked and were kind of like pock marks on his legacy, unfortunately.
Yeah, and this album to me kind of marks that line where he started to kind of tilt towards the stupid humor.
Yeah,
but it was he kept this album steeped in the guitar. It was after this that he kind of went a little bit far afield, and you get like Chic Your Booty and Joe's Garage, which have some frankly disgusting stuff on them.
Yeah, no, I'm not a fan of any of those records. I mean, it's not Zappa's worst, but it's among his worst.
Hey, I liked Chic Your Booty when I was 15. Not anymore.
Exactly.
Bobby Brown goes down.
Ugh. So, yeah. Next, Funkadelic and their two albums of this year, Tales of Kid Funkenstein and Hardcore Jollies. George Clinton had two bands that expressed with musicians, often crisscrossing between the two, that expressed his vision. The R&B, soul meets psychedelic rock assault of Funkadelic and the pure funk attack of Parliament. The latter was the more commercially successful, especially with the previous year's all-time classic Mothership Connection. But Clinton always had a fondness for what he felt was the overlooked Funkadelic, and in 1976, he had the Funkadelic outfit put out two albums. The first of these, Tales of Kid Funkenstein, is simply awesome, with the Sly Stone on acid romp of butt-to-butt resuscitation and Let's Take It to the People, which sounds like Stevie Wonder with more hair on his balls. With Bernie Worrell's whirring synthesizers, the dance floor killer Undisco Kid sounds like a Parliament outtake. And Take Your Dead Ass Home sounds like P-Funk taken to outer space.
I love Take Your Dead Ass Home.
Yeah, it is really good. Hardcore Jollies is just a slight bit inferior, but still top-notch. Coming Round the Mountain still has the dirty funkadelic grime, but infused with some serious Parliament-style funk. Smokey is, well, smoky, swampy sex funk. And Cosmic Slop is recorded live with Eddie Hazel showing why he is truly one of the long-lost guitar heroes in both rock and R&B, soul, and funk. It's yet another stellar entry in a near-flawless catalog. Chris?
Yeah, this is pretty much a pivot year for Funkadelic. This is where Funkadelic stops. They kind of make the pivot into being Parliament.
Yeah.
And so there's still some of the Eddie Hazel stuff going on, but nowhere near as much of that as there was 5 years earlier,
Right.
6 years earlier,
Yeah.
and you kind of get it, there's some of that starter funk. It's not quite as nasty and not quite as joyous as it would get on Mothership Connection,
Right.
later on in the decade, but you're
Well,
starting
Mothership
to,
Connection came out the year before, actually.
oh, it did.
Yeah,
Okay.
75.
Okay, so that was more pure. So in other words, the Parliament part was starting to take over, and so
Yes,
but
sure.
he still had enough fondness for like I said, the cosmic slop,
Yeah. Right.
to still come out with this. But this was kind of a pivot point where Parliament was winning with George Clinton by this
Yeah.
point, and so this
Yeah.
is kind of like the last stand for the funkadelic thing.
Yeah.
But
Parliament was selling records, basically.
yeah, basically. I love "Take Your Dead Ass Home" though. That's just a fun song and
Yeah.
just a great funk groove.
Yeah. All right. Now, speaking something that is not funky,
Nope.
but still fucking awesome,
Yeah, very fucking awesome. Rush's 2112.
their
Uh,
breakthrough.
Nerds of the World Unite.
Yeah.
One of the coolest experiences of my entire life was taking a ride along with Arturo actually in 2001 down Las Vegas's fabled strip at night while listening to the overture from Rush's 2112, which is as majestic a slice of prog rock heaven as ever been laid down on tape. I
Yeah.
strongly encourage all of you to do the same thing. That is a feeling of truly belonging to something not of this world, a space opera aesthetic of the highest order. Like seriously, when that bump bump when that hits and you see like the
Yeah.
Tropicana
Yeah.
and you see all that neon, that's like whoa, yeah, man, that was special. As is this album on which you can find that piece of music. I would say that 2112 is the album on Rush officially became the mighty, mighty Rush, crushers
Yes.
of progressive rock, the true kings of Fantasyland rock, the trio that became gods to nerds, geeks, and D&D playing dweebs everywhere. The album is nonsensical in content, but is also just plain damn mad fun, with towering riffs and filled with Neil Peart's otherworldly drumming. The 20-minute, 33-second long title suite makes the album a killer alone, but take the glorious ode to smoking pot, A Passage to Bangkok as an added bonus. Arturo.
Yeah, this really is like I mean, early Rush has some good stuff, but this is really where you start with Rush. It's interesting to note that during their early years, 1974, 75, they quite often opened for Kiss. Can you
Yeah,
imagine
could
going
you
to a Kiss concert and Rush opening for Kiss?
Yeah,
Jesus.
yeah, that must have been like the greatest show of all time. Yeah, I mean, Rush at its peak and Kiss at its peak.
Yeah.
At least the peak of its show experience. And so,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
like fucking Space Odysseys followed by like, guys dressed up as aliens.
And blood and guts and fireworks and explosions. Like, good Lord. If you were high, that was the best show ever.
Yeah, no shit. Wow, that must have been extraordinary. Wow.
All right, now we go back to the Northeast for 3 albums from either Massachusetts or New York. First is Patti Smith and her album Radio Ethiopia. Now, Patti Smith's debut album from the previous year, Horses, is her most lauded, beloved, and iconic album, and rightfully so. It's also one of the greatest, most influential albums ever, one that casts a gigantic shadow over anything and everything else she's done. Unfortunately, it means some truly terrific albums of hers get overlooked, and one of them is Horse's follow-up, Radio Ethiopia. What it lacks in the soul-stirring, epic grandeur of the latter, it makes up for in shorter, more concise songs that still manage to rock. Pissing in a River is so powerfully urgent in its desperation that Smith is practically levitating above the band. Pumping, with My Heart in parentheses, is the obvious single, a raging rocker and one of the most conventionally punk songs she ever did. Distant Fingers approximates buzzed out bizarro reggae, while the title track, segueing into Abyssinia, is a 10-minute opus of rambling in a good way stream of consciousness poetry, with Smith whipping herself into a frenzy and her band jamming in an improvised onslaught of feedback guided psychedelic rock. This is an album that deserves a lot more love and attention. Chris?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I love the title track. I think
Yeah.
that is like noise art of the highest form.
Yeah.
That is just some glorious noise, that the way that they come up with it, and the aesthetic of that, with her kind of unhinged poet, poet laureate. It's kind of like a female Jim Morrison bit.
Yeah.
It's kind
Totally.
of it's like a distant cousin of The End.
Right.
It's kind of in the same vein, and so that to me makes the record more than, and obviously the rest of the record's a little bit more restrained than that,
Right.
and it does pivot from horses, but I'll take the noise art. I think noise art Patti Smith is the best Patti Smith.
Yeah. Now, next is a record that came out in 1976, but was recorded way before. Chris?
Yeah, this there was it took a while for the Modern Lovers to find the light of day. It was actually recorded in like 1972 or 73. Uh
Between 71, 72, and 73, over the span of those 3 years. They were in and out of
yeah, and they
studio.
just had a lot of issues with the band members disagreeing, and Jonathan Richman not wanting to he wanting to change things up. And Jerry Harrison was actually in an early version of the Modern Lovers, Jerry Harrison of the Talking Heads.
Right.
And so there's this tortured history where, then they, were on and off of labels, and then they finally got a label, and Richmond finally was able to get an aesthetic that he could, and a tempo that he could vibe with, and you end up releasing a pretty perfect record.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I got to say, when people talk about all-time great mixtures of time and place in rock history, they rarely mention mid 1970s Boston, as
Yeah.
they would say Los Angeles in the 80s, or New York in the mid 70s, or Seattle in the very early 90s, but they
Yeah.
probably should. Most
Yeah.
notable, naturally, is the emergence of the Cars as an all-time cool-ass band later in the 70s. But there was
Yeah.
also the aforementioned Boston, and also this band, the Modern Lovers,
Right.
led by pop savant Jonathan Richman.
And
Uh,
Aerosmith.
well, and Aerosmith. Yeah, there you go. So the band specialized in stripped down but punchy proto-punk, and played it straight lyrically, doing away mostly with pretense and preferring awkward art school boy confession.
Yeah.
This classic album is filled one rockin' memorable tune after another. There's the iconic garage rock anthem that opens the record, Roadrunner, with its instantly recognizable organ riff and its unironic declaration, "I'm in love with Massachusetts."
Yeah.
There's also the menacing swagger of Pablo Picasso, which features one of the funniest lines in all of rock. Quote, "Some people try to pick up girls and get called assholes. This never happened to Pablo Picasso. He could walk down your street and girls would never resist his stare. So Pablo Picasso was never called an asshole." End quote. Plus, there's the tender but somewhat creepy girlfriend, in which Richmond, we find him longing for a relationship and imagining an ideal first date in an art museum. It's oddly compelling stuff for sure. As was this band in general. I mean, like I said, so for an album that took a long time to actually come out, they eventually got it right, right?
Yeah, they did. I mean, this is a perfect album. I totally agree with you. It's Jonathan. He was practically a teenager when they recorded this. He was about
Hmm.
18, 19, around there. And
Yeah.
the music is really pretty original. It's kind of like it's shambolic art rock with like a tinge of punk rock, or the punk
Yeah.
rock to come.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. Like proto-punk aesthetic for sure.
and lyrically, it's just your classic, sexually frustrated teenage boy from the Massachusetts suburbs is basically what the lyrics are. You know,
Geesh.
he he can- he can
Weezer,
never get
anybody?
yeah, he can
Yeah.
never get the girl. Yeah, like Weezer, right? But at least
Yeah.
Weezer got the girl eventually. But
Yeah. And
Jonathan
then and then
Richman
they,
never
then
got
their
the girl.
music started to suck once they got the girl.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So this is what this album really is, and it's an important record. I think I have it in my 500 greatest albums of all time list, and
Yeah.
it
It's
should.
it's 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 a pretty special record for sure.
And so is the next one, the final album in our lightning round, Lou Reed, Coney Island Baby. After the commercial disaster of the previous year's controversial Metal Machine music, a double album of incessant guitar noise and feedback purely for the purpose of demonstrating his displeasure with his record label, RCA. Reed knew he needed to do an about-face and make a record of appealing, more accessible rock and roll just to get his audience back. Not just to get his audience back, but to restore his reputation. And to a great extent, he did so with Coney Island Baby, an album of such sweet, catchy, tuneful, exuberant, warm, romantic songs that it's hard to believe that the notoriously crusty and curmudgeonly Reed ever had it in him. From the rolling, almost Eagles-esque country rock of Crazy Feeling, to the light pop rock of Charlie's Girl, to the majestic rock of Velvet Underground outtake She's My Best Friend. From the bluesy vamp of gleeful tongue-in-cheek murder fantasy Kicks, to the even more tongue-in-cheek, hilarious faux bravado campy rock of Gift, to the touching confessional poetry of the ballad that is the title track, where Reed reminisces about his teenage years when sometimes he just wanted to fit in with the rest. It's a picture-perfect album of sincere, emotional honesty flecked with cheeky humor and heart-on-sleeve romantic longing. Oh yeah, and the tunes are some of the best and most straightforward of Reed's career. In my list of the 10 most underrated albums of all time, this would be near or at the top. Chris?
Yeah, this is a good record. And Reed, for as much of an iconoclast as he was, in terms of his personality, was a professional's professional when it came to songwriting. Right. I mean, that guy could crank out pop tunes like it was nobody's business. And when
he wanted to.
If he wanted to. When it came time to crank out the pop tunes, he could turn it on. Yeah. And so it's, he's such a professional that it's manufactured sincerity. You're not sure if it's real sincerity or not, but it doesn't matter because the craftsmanship is top notch. And so Coney Island Baby is a very affecting song, but it's hard to tell with Lou whether he's faking it or not. Whether he'd rather be making White Heat Part 2, or if he's really feeling that. Obviously, he's looking to sell some records, and so when it came time to put the professionalism hat on, here came Lou with his gifts, and there's some really strong songs on there. Just magnificently arranged stuff too. Yeah, I just noticed I'm using the word magnificent a lot in this episode, and because hey, 1976, magnificent. It was a magnificent year.
Magnifique.
And Magnifique was the title track, especially Coney Island Baby. That's one of the better songs of the 70s.
Yeah, it really is.
I once got laid to a soundtrack of Lou Reed songs, and Coney Island Baby was on that. So it's pretty awesome. But that perfect day back to back while I'm in the middle of fucking, that was pretty good.
That's romance at its very best. All right, folks.
I guess. What a way to finish the episode. And on that note, folks, as we always do at the end of these episodes, we encourage you to join our fabulous Facebook-only curmudgeonly community. They're up on Facebook at facebook.com/group/curmudgeonrock. Good time will be had by all. Art's been posting a lot about 1976 on there lately. It was a good year, and he was pretty excited. So it's like, settle down, Beavis.
It was a night of wine.
I'm sure it was, and that came with a soundtrack. Also, so if you disagree with any of our assessments, if you think that the Modern Lovers album sucks or anything else, feel free to hit us up with some correspondence at curmudgeonrock@gmail.com. And then also, as we've been doing all year, we will have a Spotify playlist dedicated to the music of 1976 that will accompany this here episode. Check the episode description wherever you're accessing this, whether it's on Apple or Stitcher or Amazon or wherever else, and you can access that link and you can enjoy these songs either with the episode while you're listening to it or right afterwards, but the music will be fresh and accessible. So there you go.